There are a lot of first gen Latinas who grew up in a household where money was scarce, money was a source of stress, or even something like very secretive. So, how can we begin to heal our relationship with money when that is the foundation that we have inherited?
So I would encourage folks listening to be curious about your roots. There's a great book called It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wallen, and he talks about that, where many of us are carrying literal like cortisol and traumas that don't belong to us,
Wow.
and start to notice what is it about, for example, if you're going to go buy a car, what comes up for you? Where does your mind go? And then start from there and say, okay, did this voice originate with me, or is this maybe my parents, grandparents? And just kind of be observant and
Hmm.
start from there.
Hola, mi gente. Welcome back to Yo Quiero Dinero. Today, we're going to be having a real and raw conversation about a topic that it's really, really necessary, especially if you are first gen, if you're the first in your family to like try to do things differently, whether that is, personally, relationally, financially, all the things. We talk about all of that and more on the show. And so I needed to bring an expert in to help us become the cycle breakers that we were meant to be. And we have Miss Priscilla Maria Gutierrez. She is a certified trauma informed life coach and keynote speaker known as the Cycle Breaker Coach on social media. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
I think that the work that you do is so powerful because it gives us permission to really like step into uncomfortable spaces, to have uncomfortable conversations, and to really confront what has been probably toxic behavior in our upbringings, a lot of things that we go through as people navigating a world where the majority of our caretakers are coming from a very like scarcity mindset, trauma centric place. So how did you get into this space? What inspired you to show up in this way?
Yeah, I like to say it chose me
Uh,
because we were just talking about I went to Johns Hopkins as well, and I studied sociology and Africana studies. So I've always leaned towards the social justice arena,
yeah.
and that led me to law school. I went, I graduated, and I realized along the way that law was not my path. There's nothing like going to law school to really realize this is not for me.
That's an expensive lesson, honey.
Yes, girl. So thankfully, I had a scholarship, so I felt
Okay.
less guilty.
Yeah, yeah.
um, Kind of like what you were just mentioning about that scarcity mindset. I grew up knowing I have to get an education, I have to go to prestigious schools, etc., because of how my family grew up and everything they sacrificed. And so that was really what I had internalized is of course I'm going to get a secure job. Of course I'm going to get a 9 to 5. I'm going to go get my degrees. That's the American dream. That's the
Right.
way we're supposed to do it. And so I really was honestly on autopilot for most of my life. But once I graduated from law school, I'm like, whoa, I did it. I fulfilled my duties. I made my family sacrifices worth it. But why don't I feel fulfilled? Why don't
Mm,
I feel like this is what I want? And so I really had to reflect and listen to an inner voice that was saying, this isn't this isn't the life you want. And there was so much going on in my life as far as very unhealthy relationship I was in, definitely unresolved trauma I just kept putting to the side.
yeah.
And so it all kind of compounded into this awakening of, okay, do I sit for the bar or do I not sit for the bar? And I ultimately decided not to because I just couldn't envision myself being happy as an attorney. And so now what? So, like you said, I invested so much time, my family invested so much energy, resources. The whole plan was to become an attorney. Now what? And
Mm,
so I really had to be humble and not have, pride interfere with asking for help, asking for guidance, trial and error. And I worked in different spaces after law school, nonprofit, ironically for a law firm in a non attorney role, and different things like that. But Eventually, I found my way via social media. I saw someone who is a trauma informed recovery coach, and I'd never heard of such a thing. I had spent a lot of years of my life at that point in the recovery space as a patient and as someone struggling to be sober, to heal my eating disorders, to get the mental health support I needed. And so I only knew that binary of patient, psychiatrist, or therapist. So when I saw this woman have this peer support model and have her lived expertise, I was like, oh, I can do this. This is
Mm,
something that really speaks to me. It satisfies that passion I've always had to help my communities that I love. I've always loved to connect with people. Even in law school, my favorite parts of my internships were the parts where you get to speak to the clients.
yeah.
So, for example, I did an internship in a domestic violence clinic, and my favorite part was just talking to the women, just getting to know them, reassuring them, empowering them. And so, with life coaching and trauma recovery coaching, I'm able to do just that. It's not about diagnosing them, treating them. There's not this dynamic that I grew up being a part of. Is just I'm a survivor like you, and I want to walk this path with you. I want to be the advocate that I needed along
Mm,
the way.
mm-hmm.
And so it's evolved into also speaking. So, speaking of Johns Hopkins, that was the last school I spoke at back in April. And that was really healing to be able to go back to the same space. It was in the same building where my dorm was at, which was across from another dorm I stayed at, which was near a place like it was the epicenter of so many painful memories
Mm,
and a lot of self destructive behavior. And now to return years later as a professional speaker and speak to students, it's like, whoa, this is my purpose. This is what I'm meant to do. I'm meant to alchemize my pain into purpose and my wounds into wisdom for others.
mm. I thank you for sharing that backdrop because I think it sets us up for a really powerful conversation. You mentioned being a patient, if you will, in recovery. So, kind of take us back to where you first started interacting with, unhealthy patterns, unhealthy coping mechanisms, and what was the origin of that?
Yeah, great question. I would say the root of pretty much whether it was the eating disorder, whether it was the binge drinking, it really unfortunately started with a childhood trauma, and that was molestation
Mm,
by my grandfather. And so that was extremely confusing, conflicting, because in the Latin community, we're often raised to almost blindly respect our elders
yeah.
and defer to them and put them on a pedestal. And he was a second father to me. So, unlike my dad's father, who wasn't in the picture, lived with us, he traveled with us. So, it was extremely confusing. And being a child, you don't even understand what's going on. And so that really planted a seed in me. And kind of along the same lines of that familismo, when I did confide with an elder, unfortunately, they didn't take the necessary action. So
Mm,
it left me feeling even more confused. Uh, I learned to not trust myself, not trust my voice that said, "Oh, that wasn't okay." Because if someone else is saying, "Oh, that was, that wasn't molestation," like that's it.
yeah.
So that, as well as other traumas, my brother's addiction, things like that. Also, kind of that scarcity mindset I mentioned earlier. Both of my parents come from a background of trauma. So my father is a refugee from Nicaragua. He had to literally flee for his life. Very close calls in in a war zone, so they were definitely being attacked, different weapons. But thank God they survived and they weren't hit. And then on my mom's side, my grandmother also fled, but different reasons. So in that case, it was domestic violence.
Mm,
So because I went to law school, actually, I learned what parental kidnapping is. I didn't know what that was, and my mom didn't even know. But that is what my grandma did.
wow.
She didn't tell anyone. She didn't even tell my mom or my aunt. She told them that we're going on vacation to LA to visit family. They came on a Friday, she enrolled them in school on a Monday, and they never went back. So that's super traumatizing.
Wow.
And I understand now as an adult why my grandmother did that. It's because the same, my mom's father's the one who caused harm to me and multiple women in my family. So I wish I could ask her and have that conversation like, what was the breaking point? Because you
Mm,
knew he was a pedophile. You knew, unfortunately was abusing you physically.
yeah.
What was the breaking point? But I'll never know. And so that's just a very condensed version of their traumas. And so when you take two people with unhealed traumas and then they raise kids with those wounds, it's going to trickle and it's going to affect their parenting. And
Whew.
so, yeah, girl. So it was like individual and generational, just compounded. And it showed up as a lot of nervous system dysregulation, not healthy coping skills, self harm, self destruction. And so I'm blessed and thankful that my parents invested in my health. So I was able to see a therapist. I was able to go to rehab. I was able to go to wilderness program. But yeah, that's pretty much in a nutshell why I ended up in those spaces.
Yeah, yeah. And I think a lot of people who are listening to this can relate to having some traumatic experience with just their caretakers, because unfortunately, a lot of us come from households where the mode of operation was survival, right? And oftentimes that makes you make decisions that in a more grounded environment, you just would not have to make. And so, thank you for sharing that. Let's talk about the moment for you that you knew like you could not continue on in the way that you were. What is it that happened?
Yeah. My turning point was when I left that relationship that I mentioned. So again, I worked so hard throughout my life. For example, I went to four different high schools because that same scarcity mentality. My father was like, okay, I need to go where there's opportunities. So moved around a lot as a kid.
Mhm.
But throughout all those moves, I always knew I have to get good grades. So since a little girl, was always studious. And so all that time, all that energy, all that money into the degrees. But I found myself living with a boyfriend at the time. It was a very toxic relationship, abusive, etc. And so I had to really sit and think, how am I in this situation? You have all this education, but you're basically a roommate with someone that you're not in a good relationship with and sharing, he had a roommate. You don't have really your own money, your own anything. If I wasn't living with him, then I was living with other family members. So I didn't even have my own home.
Yeah.
So I'm like, what did I do wrong? I thought I did everything right. And so I really had to say this this can't continue. This is going to break me. It was already breaking me. I was already very not in a good space. It was affecting me so much physically and mentally, exacerbating my eating disorder again. A lot of things going on. And so I really had to listen to an inner voice that said, leave him. And that was really, really painful. That breakup pretty much broke me. It felt like a death. It felt like a divorce. It felt like, where the hell am I going to go now? Again, I don't have a car to my, I don't have a car. I don't have a house to my name. I don't have savings that will sustain me for a long time. And so that looked like going back to live with my parents in Michigan, of all places, and starting over. I
Mm,
didn't have anybody there, no friends, no job lined up. I just knew I'm not going to be, I don't even know how to word this. I just knew that the darkness was going to get darker and I wasn't going to make it.
mm,
And so that was my turning point, was realizing the American dream, because this individual that I was with, great job, great company. Um, we were already on set to get engaged, get married. He already expressed that to my parents. It's like I had the American dream
yeah.
packaged, but I knew what it was behind the scenes. And I'm so thankful that I got the courage and the self-love within to say, nah,
Mm.
not gonna do this.
I think there's a lot of people, including myself, who can absolutely relate with like checking off all the boxes, going to school, getting the degree, getting the boyfriend who turns into the fiance, doing the big ass wedding, buying the house. And you feel as each one of those decisions is made like further and further away from who you feel you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
How do we get to a place where we start listening to that voice earlier? Because I think there's way too many people who like shut that shit off. And everybody else's opinions, your family, your friends, your circle of influence, their voices become so much louder than the one that's like screaming inside of your head, like, you should not be doing this.
Yeah, no, definitely. And for me also, it was actually therapists that were instrumental, unfortunately, in, I mean, I take ownership for my actions, my decision, but they definitely played a pivotal role in helping in ensuring that I stayed in that relationship based on their comments, victim blaming,
Mm,
etc.
mhm,
And so what I didn't know until probably my late 20s, early 30s is the power of self-validation. And so that's something I talk about in my book because I didn't even know that was truly a thing. I had always leaned since I was, that 8-year-old girl, 10-year-old girl, confiding in that elder saying, you know, grandfather touched me. And they said, no, that like completely shut it off. I kind of internalized that I can't, like I mentioned, trust my version of events or my
mm,
experience. So since then, I would turn to my elders, I would turn to therapists, I would turn to friends, pretty much anyone outside of myself to tell me, okay, yeah, that was traumatic. You were traumatized. Oh, yeah, that's something to be mad about. Your anger is valid. It's like I needed someone else to tell me. And so once I realized through more trauma informed advocates and therapists that truly the authority on my experience is me, I was there. I was there when, throughout different sexual traumas, I was there during other events that I've gone through. It happened to my body. I'm very intelligent, I'm very aware. I can speak and dictate my own story.
mm,
And so that was really a turning point where now I can say, oh, this is how I feel, and I have every right to feel that way.
yeah,
And so, for anyone listening, please know that you are the expert on your body, on your mind, on your experiences. You don't need someone else to co sign or approve or give you the okay.
yeah.
You can do what you want to do.
Mhm. Yeah, I think getting back to self is like the key to why I was able to make so many changes in my life too, right? I really stopped caring so much about other people's opinions and realized like this does not feel good. And however it may look to other people, like I'm the one that has to deal with this day in and day out. And I'm not willing to compromise my peace anymore at this point. Not for a job, not for a man, not for any kind of like external perception of like what success looks like to people.
Exactly.
All right, so let's talk about money because there are a lot of first gen Latinas in our community who grew up in a household where money was scarce, money was a source of stress, or even something like very secretive. So, how can we begin to heal our relationship with money when that is the foundation that we have inherited?
Yeah. I would say be curious. Be curious as to why you have certain reactions, notice patterns. Like for me, I, with the exception of when we were like real little kids, yeah, we were on like food stamps and government assistance. But apart from that, I grew up in the suburbs. Yeah, finances were for the most part stable because of everything my parents invested to create that stability for my brother and I. And so, given that context, I would still have so much financial anxiety about spending money. I'm still very frugal. I used to be worse, like very very frugal, to the point that even my family is like, "What are you doing?" like it's okay to spend money. You don't have to, still I'm gonna keep it 100. Like I still go to Goodwill. I still go to the dollar store. Like, and I probably always will. Uh, and that's okay to be frugal, but when it's coming from a place of trauma, that's something that I had to realize. And it came from my father.
Mm,
It came from, for example, I can recall being in high school, nice neighborhood, dad had a great job, but being in the pantry and being worried about our spending and thinking, based on like some expenses that I saw, like, oh my gosh, if we don't track our money, we're going to be on the streets. We're not going to have food. We're not going to be okay. And that wasn't my trauma. That was my father's trauma because
mm,
that was his reality. He, as I mentioned, refugee, had to flee for his life. They had to leave everything. They slept on floors, lived in garage. They didn't have shit. And
yeah.
so he still holds that. He's still to this day, regardless of all his success, is still that scared teenager that I don't know where I'm going to live. I don't know how we're going to make it. And so I inherited that despite living in the suburbs, despite that not being my reality.
Mm,
And I didn't know that. I now I can see, oh, of course, I connected the dots, but when I was living through that, I just felt the anxiety without the understanding.
mm,
And so I would encourage folks listening to be curious about your roots. You know, there's a great book called It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wallen, and he talks about that, where many of us are carrying literal like cortisol and traumas that don't belong to us,
wow.
and start to notice what is it about, for example, if you're going to go buy a car, what comes up for you? Where does your mind go? And then start from there and say, okay, did this voice originate with me, or is this maybe my parents, grandparents? And just kind of be observant and
Hmm.
start from there.
What are some of the trauma responses that you see come up with money? So you mentioned like extreme frugality. What are some others? And how do we kind of move through that?
I would say hoarding. And I've
Mm,
seen that, not going to put anyone on blast, but different family members, respectfully, you know, just seeing them hoard. And I've learned that hoarding, no, I'm not talking about like buried alive type level hoarding, but definitely accumulating things, being very attached to things. And I learned that that in itself can be either a form of OCD or a trauma response, especially for those who didn't have that security growing up.
hmm.
And so I think that's part of the reason that I am frugal also, because I grew up around some family members kind of being the opposite. And so and I see that with some other family members where they had a similar kind of like, I'm going to do the opposite of what I saw.
Yeah.
So I see either hoarding of objects, and also hoarding of money. So kind of this mentality of we need to save, 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 and have kind of this reservoir in case the world collapses, in
Hmm.
case, again, my father came from a context of war where their land was stolen, everything, you know. And so I've learned from people like yourself that that's not the way you build wealth. That's not the way you build uh, truly the life you want. You have to invest, you have to take some risk.
Yeah.
And so, definitely being risk adverse, hoarding, saving, being frugal, those were kind of the things that I saw. Not so much in my family, but I have seen this with loved ones where it's kind of the opposite, where, well, shit, if I'm going to die young, then I'm just going to spend, spend, spend and get that dopamine and live my life. And so I think it's really important to get a balance
Mm,
where you're fulfilled, but also responsible.
yeah. I love that advice. Okay, let's talk about family pressure and boundaries, okay? Because being a cycle breaker is going to make you an unpopular person in your family, more than likely, especially when you start saying no. So, what is your advice for having hard conversations with relatives, like let's say around money, for example, when some people might see your success as you owing them something?
That's a great point. Um, and to be transparent, I'm not at that level of success where anyone is like putting their hands out, but I have seen it with different family members that have been very successful, where it's like, yeah, don't forget whose couch you were sleeping on, whose floor you were sleeping on, and who helped you come to the States, the immigration process, things like that. And so I would say know your audience. So to be frank, I'm not on speaking terms with a lot of relatives. Being a cycle breaker, being someone that has openly spoken up about the abusers in our family and things like that. And so I've learned that sometimes less is more,
Mm,
because if you're talking to someone who maybe isn't at a point in their journey where they're able to even receive your message, it's kind of a draining experience. And I speak from someone who's felt that, because if you start talking about trauma and healing and therapists, they're like, whoa, what like you're crazy. You're crazy. God's my therapist. You're doing too much. You're
that's the one.
dramatic. Yeah, yeah. So it's you become kind of this loca troublemaker, and they don't want anything to do with you.
Yeah, you just stirring the pot because God forbid you calling people out on their shit.
Exactly. And so sometimes that no is more powerful and effective than no puedo, or like I can't because reason, if they're
Mhm.
not even in a space to receive it or listen.
Yeah. Jeez. Yep. I mean, I think there's some people who are a little triggered by what we're just talking about because you might be the one. You might be the one having to put people in their place. And unfortunately, that is kind of the mantle that you have chosen to carry as becoming a cycle breaker. Like you have to be the one that sets that new foundation of what is acceptable behavior and not, so that then you can model for your children or future generations like what we're going to be doing going forward. It ends with me, right? All right, let's talk about resentment, because as a cycle breaker, we are typically the first to quote unquote make it, right? um what do we do with the resentment? Like how can we handle it when others expect us to pull them up with us?
Yeah. And I've seen that in my own family. And I would say I've kind of like the sacrifices that I felt I had to validate with my own parents. I've learned that guilt is a choice and I don't have to feel it.
mm, Talk about it.
So, like, even with my parents, they're the first ones to be like, you don't owe us anything. Like, we did everything out of love. We just want you to be happy and successful. And that's how it should be. Like I think of different good deeds or things that I've done. If you're doing it with an expectation of praise or an expectation of that person being indebted to you, then you're not really doing it out of love. And so I think that's important to recognize and helps me with the guilty feeling, because anyone that's coming at me with some type of negative energy, it's like, well, I thought what you did was out of love. Did I enter a contract with you that I
Mm,
said, you know, the help and love that you gave me as a minor, when I become of age and have my own money, I'm going to give you like help me understand, the thought
the
process. And
logic
so,
here.
yeah, and so I think of the four agreements, and one of them being not taking things personally. And so, what people choose to feel towards me is out of my control.
Mm,
If you want to feel resentful towards me, if you want to label me a crazy loca, that's out of my control. All I can do is be myself and practice my self care, be in control of my mindset, my actions, and recognize truly your feelings of resentment are not mine to manage, are not mine to minimize, are not mine to alleviate. That is honestly a you situation.
yeah, yeah. All right, let's talk about breaking the cycle for the next generation. So there's a lot of folks who listen to the show who are parents who want to make their child's upbringing, their experience different from what theirs was. What does it look like to raise kids from a trauma informed lens when we didn't necessarily have that ourselves?
Yeah, and I love that you're a new mom. That gives me a lot of hope because I want to be a mom one day. And I'll give you an example. When I was in the wilderness program, and for those who may not know what that is, you basically live in the desert. They ship you out to the desert, you out there by yourself. Like it's wild. And so um but while I was there, I remember it mostly white people, and it was just me, Latina, and then my like best friend there was a African American guy. And we were the only ones that were like pro hitting kids. I don't know why we were on that topic, but we were like, yeah, like we got hit, you know. And I remember one of the staff member be like, "And now look where you are." Like, how did that work out? I was like, "Whoa, like you're getting too comfortable." But that hit me so hard. I was like, "Oh shit, like yeah, how did that really help me?" And I always thought growing up, I'm going to hit my kids. That's how you raise kids up. And even in the social media streets, I see a lot of black and brown folks still saying you got to hit your kids, you got to
Mm,
discipline them, etc. And so that is one cycle that I am so committed to breaking, because I got hit, but the men in my family got it so much worse. And none of them, I can see the effects of what that did to them. It did
yeah,
not help them, and it did not help me.
yeah,
And so I use that as an example to again be curious. What is your approach when it comes to parenting, either what you're planning to do or what you currently do? For example, the tough love, the hitting, the etc. Why do you want to do it? What do you think that actually does? Have you read up on it? There's plenty of research that discredits beating the shit out of your kids as an effective parenting tool.
yeah.
Read about that. Um, just be very informed. You know, the key word is informed. Read books, read literature, read studies, and maybe even write a letter to your inner child. Talk to that inner child, connect with them again, and see what actually helped you during your childhood. And I bet you it wasn't the belt. It
Mm,
was probably those moments where you felt safe, where you felt heard, not judged,
yeah.
and really lean into those tools.
Mm, yeah. That's so powerful. What is one belief that you have had to unlearn to step into this new version of yourself?
So many, but I think the Marianismo in our culture that's prevalent. So for those who may not know, in the Latin culture, there's this cultural script founded in the Virgin Mary in Catholicism, where women are to be self-sacrificial, of service. And I really grew up with that. Literally, I grew up Catholic. And then just what I saw growing up in my extended family, the women are the ones cooking, the women are the ones taking care of domestic duties, the men are the providers. In some instances, I can think of certain female relatives where it's like the man will decide what they do, where they sit, you know, any decision. And so I grew up with that idea that my worth was tied to how of service I was to people. And so even in school, I remember a teacher nicknamed me like Mother Teresa, which I mean, she was problematic, but I get what she was saying, you know, that I was like overly generous. She said I would help people and at the expense of me getting my work done. I remember she told my parents that. And so honestly, I was doing that throughout my life, and
Mm,
I still kind of do it, but a lot less,
yeah.
where I will be cold outside, but I'll give you the coat so that you're warm. I did that with that relationship that I mentioned, where I pretty much became his rehabilitation center.
Mm,
I'm going to give you, let me save you type thing. And
yeah.
so I had to learn, no, Priscilla, trying to stop putting yourself in the back burner and putting yourself on fire to make others warm. Take up space. It's not selfish. It's not arrogant.
Yeah.
You're not being a bitch. You're not being, you know, difficult. You're being a woman that loves herself and that sees value in her word, in her actions. And she doesn't have to keep moving to the side or behind people and get smaller to make other people comfortable. So that was probably the biggest one, because being an entrepreneur and speaking and writing, you're really taking up space. And I had to get comfortable with that. I had to get comfortable with people not liking what I say, distancing themselves from me, judging, things like that, because the cost of being silent, I couldn't take it anymore. It was going to cost me my life. It already cost me my happiness. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to break free from that.
Mm. Well, damn, I think that's the mic drop moment of the episode. Priscilla, for folks who want to learn more about what it's like to work with a trauma informed coach like yourself, tell us how you work with your clients, where we can find out more about you, about your book. Tell us all the things.
Yeah, so my website is my name, priscillamaria.com. You can see information about my book, my coaching, and my speaking. And the way it works is I work one-on-one. So you can book a free consultation call. We can check in, see if there's a match chemistry, how I may be able to support you. And I also am moving into Substack to create the Cycle Breakers Club and kind of that community where we all can just support one another. But definitely the best place is my website and also Instagram at Cycle Breaker Coach.
Thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for giving us permission to break cycles, big and small. I think it is very much a ripple effect that happens when you decide that you're going to be the one that changes things. You might not notice, but trust and believe that future generations will be very thankful for the work that you have done to make sure that we are, getting out of the toxic mentalities that have held us back, getting out of that scarcity mindset that is keeping you small. Ain't nobody got time for that in 2025 and beyond. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.